Hello and welcome to Hear These Words, a podcast from Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in Sequesta, Florida. I'm Derek Larson, the Associate Rector here at Good Shepherd, and it's so great to have you here with us today. Each week on the podcast, we discuss the passages of Scripture assigned for the upcoming Sunday. And this week is the 25th Sunday after the Pentecost, November 19th, 2023. And the words we hear are from the book of Judges, chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, Psalm 123, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Well, we've had a scheduling hiccup, and I don't have a guest today, but I still wanted to take some time and sit down with all of you, our listeners, to look at the passages coming up for this coming Sunday, and to reflect on them and to prepare ourselves to hear them in worship. So we can get started with that. This is the 25th Sunday after the Pentecost, as I said, the second to last Sunday before Advent, and the last Sunday of wearing green. The last Sunday after the Pentecost, the last Sunday before the season of Advent, is normally white as we celebrate Christ the King. And then we break from sort of our lectionary cycle that we've been working through. So in some ways, this coming Sunday, November 19th, is the last Sunday in this season, in this progression of readings that we've been working through Genesis and the Torah, through Joshua and Judges, through 1 Thessalonians we're working through now, and through the book of Matthew. So the first reading is from the book of Judges, as I mentioned, Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. And this is really just a glimpse of the book of Judges. Last week, we had a glimpse of the book of Joshua. We read the very ending of Joshua, the last chapter. And so now we're beginning with one of the first stories in the book of Judges. There's a couple of chapters that are introductory. Chapter 3 has a few short stories. Chapter 4 is sort of our first long story. And it begins like this. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of the king Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth HaGoim. The Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. And then it goes on to talk about how Deborah, God had favor on Deborah, and she rose up an army of Israelites against the king in Canaan who was fighting against them. So here in the book of Judges, that's the rhythm, that's the repetition there. It always starts off. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then it picks up, but God raised up a judge to bring them back to the Lord and to take care of them. So what we're seeing here is that this is the people of Israel living in the land of Canaan that they had just come in and essentially conquered to settle down there. But they have not yet established strong borders. And so the Canaanites and others are always kind of creeping into their area. And not only that, but the Israelites themselves find themselves conforming to the nations around them and starting to worship their gods. And so the story of the book of Judges is the story of ancient Israel before it was well established, when they were still having a hard time living as a set-apart people and worshiping the God of Israel. Last week we saw that they promised in the sight of Joshua to do just that, to worship the God of Israel. But Judges, the book of Judges, the very next book, is all about how they struggled with that. Over and over again, they struggled with that. But each time they struggled, God raised up for them a judge, not a king, but a judge who would lead them back to the Lord, and especially lead them against the armies that were fighting against them at that time. So if you haven't read the book of Judges, it's a really interesting book, and it's sort of the comic book of the Bible. And what I mean by that is these judges, there's 12 of them, are sort of superhero-like. We get all kinds of stories of super strength and military tactics, brilliant military tactics, and so on. So you have stories of someone, Samson fighting an entire army by himself with the jawbone of a donkey, who has super strength until you cut his hair. Someone cut his hair in the night and he lost all of his strength. You have the story that if we were to read further in chapter 4, we would see another woman who defeats the military captain by luring him into her house for a nap, and then when he's napping, she takes the spike, the tent spike to hold down the corners, and drives it through his head into the ground. So it's quite an extravagant, dramatic, and violent book, but it's a book of all of these military heroes that do extravagant things. This chapter that we're reading is particularly interesting because the judge is a woman. It's Deborah the prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. And so here we have this wonderful example. This entire chapter, actually, chapter 4, is about lifting up the strength and power of women as leaders and as military victors. And so it's really an incredible story. I think for us, it has a lot to say about what it means to lean on God in times of need. The Israelites had trouble doing that, but the judges were there to remind them to do that, to lean on the God of Israel, and the God of Israel will take care of you. And so I just wonder, we don't have judges as they had in ancient Israel. But I wonder who those judges are in our lives that remind us to lean on God when times get hard, when we fall away, when we focus on other things, when we follow our own path instead of God's path. Who are the people in our lives that always remind us to lean back on God, to go back to God, and that's where we will find help in the midst of our trouble. That's the role of the judges, and that was the role of Deborah here in this chapter 4 of the book of Judges. So after the book of Judges, then we get into 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and essentially at the end of Judges, the people of Israel say, enough is enough, we need a king. We want a king to be like other nations. And God says, you don't want a king. Believe me, you don't want a king. And they said, no, we do want a king. And so God said, all right, I'll give you a king. We won't get to that in this lectionary cycle. We'll read it another time. But if you wanted to keep reading, that would be the next part of the story. Our psalm is Psalm 123, and it's quite short. It's only 5 verses. I'm trying to remember if this is one of the shortest. Yeah, it's not the shortest psalm in the book of Psalms, but it is one of the shortest. So I'll just read the whole thing. To you I lift up my eyes, to you enthroned in the heavens. As the eyes of servants look to the hand of their masters, and the eyes of a maid to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God, until he shows us his mercy. Have mercy upon us, O Lord, have mercy, for we have had more than enough of contempt. Too much of the scorn of the indolent rich, and of the derision of the proud. So it starts off beautifully. To you I lift up my eyes, to you enthroned in the heavens. And so it matches very well with our first reading and how Deborah brought the people of Israel back to worship of the God of Israel. And here, this is what the psalm is calling us to do, to lift up our eyes to the heavens, to God enthroned in the heavens. It's an interesting psalm to me, though, because of its length and because it seems to end so abruptly. It ends with verse 5, too much of the scorn of the indolent rich and of the derision of the proud. There's no conclusion there. It doesn't keep going. It doesn't say why it brought in the rich. And so when I think about this, number one, I wonder if we're missing part of the psalm, the original psalm that was left off in the manuscripts. Number two, maybe we aren't missing it, but you can almost imagine someone writing down this psalm, and it ends kind of on a heavy note or a tired note. We've had more than enough of contempt, too much of the scorn of the indolent rich and the derision of the proud, and they got tired that they didn't want to keep writing. Like they were just burdened by this thing that was going on in their lives. And it makes me wonder, what was it that had shown contempt? What rich was he talking about that were indolent, and who was acting so proud that he or she, whoever wrote this psalm, was just feeling so tired out by them? Whatever the case, this is a psalm of humility. The posture of it is humility. The psalmist looks up to God enthroned in the heavens and compares themselves to a servant looking at the hand of their master, to a maid looking at the hand of their mistress. And then it's also a psalm of humility because it seems to be a psalm for the poor, or a psalm for those in lower economic classes, because it points out the injustice or the indolence of the rich. And so presumably this person was not one of the rich, but they were one of those that were feeling burdened because of the rich. And so you can almost see that this psalm could be the beginning of a protest psalm, a psalm which calls out the injustice of the rich and lifts up the poor. But ultimately, this psalm is a psalm of humility, which is something that our world, I think, could use more of. To you I lift up my eyes, to you enthroned in the heavens. As the eyes of servants look to the hand of their masters, as the eyes of a maid to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God until he show us his mercy. We could use the mercy of God. Our second reading is from 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. We've been slowly working our way through the book of 1 Thessalonians, and just as a review, 1 Thessalonians is the oldest book in the New Testament. At least that's what most scholars believe about this book. It was written by Paul to the Christians in Thessalonica, and it has as its main theme hope and encouragement in the midst of people dying and the community waiting on the coming of Christ. And so that early church, the church has always waited on Christ. We got some of that in our reading from last week, and we get some of it here as well. The church has always been waiting for the coming of Christ, but in these first few decades, first few years of the church after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, they really expected Jesus to come at any moment, and they didn't expect people to start dying before Jesus came, and so they struggled. What happens to those that have died? And last week we saw that Paul encouraged them and said they also will be raised, and they will participate in the parousia, the coming of Jesus when he comes. And so here we get a continuation of that, a continuation that says you've got to be ready because you don't know when Christ is coming, but Christ will come soon. It begins, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. But you, beloved, are not in darkness, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness. So then let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep at night and those who are drunk get drunk at night. But since we belong to the Lord, let us be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing." So you can see this passage is a passage of encouragement. Encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing. Here at the end of the season after the Pentecost, we get a lot of passages about eschatology, about the end of the world, about the coming of Christ. And interestingly, that's one of the themes of Advent. So we almost are preparing ourselves for the preparation of Advent. We talk a little bit about eschatology now, and we talk a little bit about eschatology then. But it seems to me that this conversation about the end of the world and the coming of Christ is particularly relevant to what's going on in the world today. A lot more people have been talking about the coming of Christ and the end of the world lately because of the war in the Holy Land. And people I've seen on Facebook and other places, people cite biblical passages which point to or imply that these are signs that Christ is coming. But I think it's always important to remember that the scriptures specifically say you won't know. You won't know. It'll come suddenly and as a surprise. You won't know. And while wars may take place, and all of those things need to take place, they themselves are not necessarily signs that Christ is coming and that the end of the world is here. And here in this passage it says, when they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. And you don't have to worry about that because you're in Christ, it says. But it doesn't say when there is war and famine and earthquakes and violence. It says when there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. And so, as we're reflecting on what the meaning is of the violence that's taking place in the Holy Land and other places around the world, it's important to remember that, we don't know when Christ is coming back. We don't know the signs of the end of the world. All of these things are things that have happened since the beginning of time. Wars, famine, violence, those things continue to happen. And they come in seasons. Sometimes they're more prevalent and sometimes they are less prevalent. And I don't think that we should get too anxious about what that means and whether the world is coming to an end, because that's not what the testimony of Scripture says. Instead, Scripture says Christ comes to us in the poor and the needy, as we will hear in our gospel passage next week on Christ the King Sunday. And so Christ is coming to us. Christ is coming to us in those who are poor and those who are needy, those who are being hurt, those that do not have, those that are suffering in the Holy Land and in other places. And so how might we welcome and greet Christ in those people rather than being anxious about Christ coming to end the world, which we do not know the time. And so all we can do is welcome Christ in in the least of these, so that we will be able to welcome Christ in the last day. Finally, our gospel reading for this week is Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. And it's another parable, one of the more famous parables, probably. It is the parable of the talents. And it is about a man who has slaves who goes on a trip, and he entrusts his property to his slaves, to 3 different slaves. He gave one slave 5 talents. A talent is a unit of money in the ancient world. He gave one slave 5 talents, and one slave 2, and one slave 1 according to his ability, and then he went away. And then the one slave who had 5 talents went and traded them, and he was able to double his holdings and made 5 more talents. So now he's got 10. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents doubled his, and so he had 2 and now he had 4. But the one who received only 1 talent went off and he dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. So then the master comes back and he greets the slaves and says, where is my property? What's my money? What have you done with it? The first slave with the 10 talents now comes forward and says, you gave me 5, but here's 5 more. And the master says, well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. And then he does the same thing to the second servant, who brings him 4 talents when he started only with 2. And then finally, the last slave comes and he says, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. And his master replied, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return, I would have received what was my own, at least with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, as I said, this is a passage that many of us know well. It's a parable that we've heard often, the parable of the talents. And the traditional understanding is that God has given us each something, whether that be money, whether that be talents, time, skill. We are each given something, and it's our job to use that for the betterment of the world and for the betterment of God's kingdom. And if God returns, if Christ returns and finds that we have not used what he gave us, then we will be missing out. We will have been, we will have failed at what Christ has called us to do. And so, it's a nice parable that kind of reminds us to use the gifts that God has given us for the good of the kingdom. Or is it? This parable takes place right after last week's parable. And if you heard my sermon last week, I flipped it upside down and said, maybe this parable isn't what we think it's about. And I sort of believe that that's possible about this passage as well. If you're looking through the Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25, and you see the way the parables are laid out and the themes here, it is possible to read these passages, these 2 parables that are side by side, in upside down way. So last week, the assumption is that Christ is the bridegroom who is coming. And I made the case that maybe that's not the case in that passage. In other passages and then throughout church history, Christ is compared to the bridegroom. But in this passage, there's some inconsistencies. In the passage last week, there were some inconsistencies that lead me to believe that perhaps In that passage, the bridegroom is not Christ, but one who comes and claims to be Christ or claims to be the Lord, someone that represents the lords of the world that hoard power over others in an unjust way. Those that shut people out because they do not have enough, and those that offer no grace or forgiveness, because that's what we see in the passage, is that the bridegroom refused to offer grace and mercy, refused to offer hospitality for the bridesmaids simply because they were late, even though he was late, and because they didn't have the oil. That's one reading of it. I understand that there are other readings of that passage and perhaps more traditional readings. But I think that if you look at the text in chapter 24 and 25, and I'd like to kind of outline this in a document, you can see that perhaps flipping the parable upside down like that is warranted in the text. I believe that the same thing is happening in this passage. I don't know what I'm going to preach yet on Sunday, but I think that the same thing is happening here, particularly because of this last line. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. This is directly contrasted with the rest of the Gospels and the rest of the book of Matthew, where Jesus is always saying, blessed are the poor, blessed are those that do not have, and woe to the rich who do have, for what they have will be taken away from them and given to the poor. This is the exact opposite of what Jesus has been saying throughout his entire ministry. And here you have this harsh man, this master. We assume that the master in this passage, in the traditional reading, is Jesus. But again, perhaps this is an unjust master in the world. And the last slave, he specifically says about his master that he's earned his money in unjust ways. He reaps where he doesn't sow, and he scatters seeds, or he gathers where he didn't scatter seed. And so this man is only concerned about making more money. He's only concerned about increasing his profits, and he's willing to do that even in unjust ways. He's essentially stealing. He's stealing from his neighbors by gathering in places where he didn't even plant the seed. And so here, this one slave is afraid of him. And in his fear of him, he knows also that his master is making money unjustly. And so he hides the talent that was given to him, and he gives it back. And he's punished for that. He's again punished because of what he doesn't have. Does that sound like Jesus? Is Jesus the master that is only concerned about profits? Is Jesus the master that shuts us out and calls us worthless because we don't have something, or because we didn't increase our profits? Does Jesus sound like the master who gives to those that have and takes away from those that don't have? Or is this master a different master? A master that operates in the ways of the world, where those that have are blessed and those that don't have are not blessed. Perhaps this parable, again, is a parable showing an example of what it is to live under the master of the world. There's this line here that says, when the master rewards the first two slaves for doubling what he gave them, he says, well done. And then he says, come into the joy of your master. I think for me, the question is, do we want to live in the joy of our earthly masters that only value us based on what we can give them, by what profit we can earn for them? Or do we want to live in the joy of the Lord? The joy of the Lord, our heavenly master, the one who judges us not by what we have or what we make for him, but by what we give to those that don't have. So again, as I mentioned in my sermon last week, this week we get This passage is immediately followed by the sheep and the goats. And in the sheep, and while in this passage and the bridesmaids passage, it doesn't explicitly say that Christ is the bridegroom or Christ is the master. In the story of the sheep and the goats, it does explicitly say that the Son of Man, or Jesus, is the judge. And in that passage, Jesus judges, again, by what people give to those that do not have. You have these people in the passage that have nothing, and they are given something because they have nothing. Where in this passage we read today, you have a master who takes away from someone who has nothing because he has nothing. There's a difference. It's inconsistent. So, the traditional reading, again, is that we should use the gifts that God gives us, and that's a beautiful interpretation, and it's a true interpretation. But because of the inconsistencies and because of where this is placed in the books of Matthew 24 and 25, I suspect and I wonder if there's another meaning to this parable. And that's a parable about what it means to live in the joy of the masters of this world, as opposed to living in the joy of our heavenly master, who is Jesus Christ. Well, even though there's just one of me, I've still talked for 30 minutes. So I will wrap it up now. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us today and listening this week and other weeks that you are with us. You can join every week and never miss an episode if you simply subscribe to this podcast. You can subscribe to our YouTube page, and you can also subscribe to our podcast wherever podcasts are found. And you can share it with your friends. It's always good to share. We look forward to worshiping with you this Sunday and hope that now you feel a little more prepared to hear these words. We'll see you soon.